welcome to our chat. A little bit of a difference from what we have posted as far as what this talk's going to be. We've tweaked it after debating and talking and fleshing this out. And we decided that, this is actually more about what you need to know in order to design for and with people of all abilities. And I want to say hi. My name is Adam Moreland. I'm a creative at Bloomworks. I'm here with Joel Isaac, who is a manager and accessibility specialist at Nova Ellis Consulting, and Pia Zaragoza, who's a Presidential Innovation Fellow, as we know, and is with GSA and TTS. Want to say hi, guys?
Hey there, everybody.
Hello.
Glad to be here.
Super excited. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Okay, let's get this going. So, we have an agenda here, and I wanted to acknowledge, first off, that each and every one of us in this session, and anybody who's watching this, we all have different considerations, different needs, different preferences, and we built this presentation around understanding that and knowing that we all have these unique roles, perspectives, and lived experiences. And even in this space and in this Code for America community, there's a lot of nuance and variety in the individuals that make this up. There's people who are in design and research, there's people in leadership, engineering and product, program managers, quality assurance. There's a lot of different people out there, and there's a lot of different people in here. And we wanted to acknowledge that, and also acknowledge the fact that we're going to talk a bit about accessibility and fully acknowledging that there's people doing this work, and there's people who are doing this work really well. And this is both for them and for people who want to get started in accessibility. So we're going to talk a little bit about 3 different takeaways. First one being, what is digital accessibility? What are we talking about? And providing some context about what we're going to be chatting about. Number 2 is inclusive design and research best practices, both from industry and government. So we're going to talk a little bit about what works and how you can apply that. And then the third takeaway is how to be an advocate, how to work some of this into what you're already doing, how to make your products more accessible, or how to identify things and make them more accessible. And I wanted to start off here with a quote. "The power of the web is in its universality. Access by everyone, regardless of disability, is an essential aspect." And this is from Tim Berners-Lee, who's the W3C director, which you'll hear about in a bit. And I want to put the emphasis here on everyone. And coming from my explanation first coming in here, we all have different configurations. And I want to zoom really far out and put this into a really big picture context. There's 7.5 billion of us on the planet. That's a lot of people. And more than half, as of 2021, of those users are internet users. Which means that there's 4,600,000,000 people that are using different devices, operating systems, browsers, input devices. We have different levels of internet speed, different levels of connectivity, based on our location. We speak different languages. There's a lot of variety on the internet, in fact, to a staggering degree. And how we can access it can vary wildly from user to user. And speaking of users, 1 in 4 Americans in the US experience some form of disability. And this number is growing. According to the CDC, this is going, we're going to, I'm going to take a step back. We have 1 in 4 Americans in the US experience some form of disability. And this is also, we want to talk about the 3 and 4. Who are their families, who are their communities, their caregivers, who experience this along with them. And that will all be eventually part of this figure at some point in our lives. And we wanted to ask ourselves, how might we ensure that design and research efforts involve people with disabilities that are seen, heard, and understood? How can we embed inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, or idea, into our cultural DNA? How can we put empathy into action? And we'll talk a little bit about types of tech, so you can understand a little bit about the diverse user experience and tools that'll help you better understand not only your users' needs, but the people you work with. And how do we recognize exclusion at each stage of development? What are the opportunities that we can have to include more voices and lived experience in our work? So I want to turn it over to Joel, who's going to talk a little bit about digital accessibility.
So digital accessibility is a measure of the ability to perceive, understand, interact in a digital environment with a variety of tools and platforms and just different approaches to accessing information and technology content.
Awesome. And now we're going to talk about laws. So there's the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, Section 508, Americans with Disabilities Act, and the 21st Century Video and Communications Act.
Each of these are important rules. 508 is one that you probably are familiar with, that there's been a revamp. It's very much more closely tied to the ADA and the WCAG guidelines now. I believe 508 is synonymous with WCAG 2.0. And then you have the 21st Century Video and the 21st Century Communication Video Accessibility Act, which is a newer guideline that folks in the government and in the public are using to consider how wireless and newer technologies, including this open platform that we're using right now.
And going to the next slide, let's talk about types of disabilities just to level set. So there's cognitive, auditory, speech, mobility, and vision. And with that said, it can be temporary, it can be situational, and it could be multiple disabilities, and it could be acquired. You could be born with it, or it could also be acquired later in life. And so with that said, let's go ahead and go to the next slide and talk about the aging population. So what's really interesting is that older adults are projected to outnumber children for the first time in US history. And what that means is 1 in 4 Americans will be 65 years and older, and that's from the US Census Bureau. Turning it over to Joel.
And we're talking about aging, and initially Pia talked about disabilities, and it's more thinking about like single disabilities. But as we age, even if you have a disability to begin with, you can acquire more. Or even if you don't have a disability within your youth or adulthood, you can acquire multiple disabilities as you age. And what's interesting, a lot of times we don't like change. So I've had a lot of experience with older adults that don't even recognize they have a disability, but you still have to accommodate them.
And with that, let's go ahead and talk about systemic ableism.
So first of all, what is ableism? You may ask yourself. So it's really a biased way of thinking based on ability. You as somebody who's fully abled may judge people that don't have the same abilities that you have as lesser. It does skew how people interact with each other. And we do see ableism throughout the design process. So in research, a lot of times the research participation is based on a narrow scope of participants or users, people that we think will be the best users for our tool or product or whatnot. But we usually underestimate that audience, and it becomes a broader audience. Also at the design level, we may be just designing for ourselves. So like, if this looks good to me, it must be good to everybody. And I've found so many times that is not a reality. Also in engineering, same thing. Like, I've worked with a lot of engineers that will say, well, I tested it, it worked, I was able to do everything, but they're just thinking about their ability, and that bias is getting in the way. On a larger level, when we think about program management, as a leadership, the leadership may be not aware that we really need that diversity. So they're just really focusing on what the narrow focus is, and it really creates an uninclusive product.
And with that, we're going to go ahead and transition over to what is poor. So take it away, Adam.
Yeah, thanks, Pia. And we wanted to talk about some of the solutions here and what accessibility is built around. And it goes back to 4 basic principles. So what I want you to do is when you're viewing your content or when you're viewing any content on the web, ask yourself the following questions. Is it perceivable? Can the content be heard or read via both one senses or assistive tech? And I saw someone in the chat saying that, you know, there's not a single financial website that works for blind people. You know, making sure that these things can actually be perceived, and that seems like something that's so simple and obvious, but you'd be surprised how often that can be overlooked. You know, is it operable? Can a user actually interact with it? You know, and this ties to engineers, your links and controls. Can you physically manipulate this? You know, this is where clicking on everything and testing everything and using different devices comes into play, so that you can make sure that, yes, while you may be able to interact with it with one input device, does this work for all of them? Is it understandable? And this kind of ties into content. You know, ask yourself, does the content make sense to somebody who's not the person who wrote it? You know, not your audience may not be in the same field or space that you are. So using jargon and not defining terms and things like that can really make content obtuse and difficult to understand. So making sure that you're writing things clearly, defining things, and making sure that it's actionable. Like, will the user know what to do with this information when they're reading it? You know, make sure that that works. And robust. Is it compatible with a variety of technologies and tools and approaches? And test. This is where we want to put things into, like browser stack, for instance, test with a variety of browsers. You know, I use Safari, and I'm kind of in the minority here. A lot of other people use Chrome. Check it out in a lot of different browsers. Try all of the different tools available so you poke it. You know, try it out. Use assistive tech. Ask people that you know who use tech to test it out. And you know, these elements apply not only to web but to mobile too. And that's why we call this digital accessibility, because access has evolved past just being a web or sitting on your computer. You know, it's spread out into a more organic and varied space. And you may think that these 4 items are really straightforward, and by all appearances they are, but some of these elements, like how they can be interpreted and implemented, may not be as straightforward as you think. And Joel and Peter are going to go over some examples of this in access versus accessibility.
Absolutely, Adam. So access and accessibility, they sound so similar. Aren't they the same? Well, no. So access is just being able to, say, get into the room. But accessibility gives you the ability to understand and interact and approach what's in the room. So, like for instance, we're looking at a slide of a lift that has a step in front of it. So maybe that architect thinks that building is accessible because, wow, somebody in a wheelchair can take that elevator and go up and down. They can go to multiple floors, but they don't realize they've created a barrier with that step. How is somebody in a wheelchair going to even interact with that elevator if they can't get there? We have other examples. For instance, there is captioning here where you're seeing an image of this commentator, and there's captionings explaining exactly what they're saying. So if I'm deaf, I can understand what's being said. But then we have another slide where there's another set of captions that's saying that the person's laughing, and clearly that person is not happy and they aren't laughing. So that's a fail in the captioning. You have access to the captions here, but they're not accessible because they're not informing you what's actually happening. So they're not actually understandable.
And here you see a computer, And there is a speech bubble that says image1.png. And
That's interesting.
I always remember hearing this sitting next to Joel back at our old job when we used to work together. And yeah, fun story there.
As a person who's blind, I rely on, well, I can't see images, obviously, but if those images are meaningful, I rely on an accurate description to let me know how that content is important to what I'm interacting with. So in this case, image one may meet the accessibility guidelines. Oh, there's an alternative text there, but it's completely meaningless. So the fact that it's not understandable makes it inaccessible.
All right, and so inclusive design and research best practices from industry and government. We're going to talk about where we are and how to frame the future. All right, so universal design stems from architecture and making buildings usable by all people to the greatest extent possible without the need for adaptation or specialized design. And this is from the great architect, Ronald Mace. And with that said, inclusive design starts to kind of talk about not just physical spaces, but now we're kind of talking about digital spaces, hence digital accessibility. So if we go to the next slide, inclusive design and research is all about creating and informing programs, products, services, and resources that advance accessibility, but really encompasses the full range of human diversity, including ability, language, culture, gender, and age. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. Cards Against Humanity. How many of you are familiar with this? Well, it's a game, but this is a really exciting thing that we've seen in industry recently, Cards for Humanity. And it's a tool for inclusive designers. And what's really great is it really brings to life accessibility personas and really understanding what we were kind of talking about earlier, the diversity, the range of diversity within ability, habits, and preferences, which we'll talk about shortly. But this is all about working out how you could best meet their needs. And so it's interactive, but most importantly, it humanizes the work. So in going to the next slide, this may be familiar to a lot of you. This in particular was created by three folks, Henry Swan, Ian, I'm so sorry for the butchering of the last names, but Pouncey, and Hayden Pickering, and four people, Leonie Watson, when they were at Barclays. And they have now been advancing this work and inclusivedesignprinciples.org, and a lot of our resources in government actually point to this just because there's just so many gems. So for instance, provide a comparable experience, give control, offer choice, consider situation, be consistent, prioritize content, and add value. But in the next slide, I just want to make a call out on this slide in particular. It's actually a poster that was produced by the Ontario local government on who is typically excluded. And this is for anybody who's an inclusive design or research practitioner or anybody managing a program looking to really design with and for people of all abilities. Here is what you need to really start thinking about how to include. How do you include seniors into work? Thinking about urban, rural, and suburban. Thinking about women, immigrants. Of course, we are talking a lot about disabilities, racial equity, the LGBTQIA+ community, low income, low literacy, and indigenous. And in a minute, we're going to talk about identity and the intersectionality of how all of this comes to play. But just wanted to kind of share this with all of you. And then lastly, the UK government produced these posters of how this actually, the technical aspects of accessibility and how this actually makes it into essentially design. I also want to say that the US Web Design System is also a really great resource on this, plus how it translates into a design system. And with that said, we're going to go ahead and switch over to the next slide. And this is something that if you take away 4 things from inclusive design and research and what to do next and where to begin, this work by Professor Amy Hurst is really a great starting point in how to really start humanizing your inclusive design and research practice. And Amy Hurst talks about habit, preference, and ability. Habits being an acquired mode of behavior that has become nearly or completely involuntary. It's also then there's also preferences, which is a technical term in the decision-making process, usually about choosing between alternatives. But then, interestingly enough, there's ability. And with ability comes power, competency, and capacity, in addition to the quality or state of being able. But in my work as a Presidential Innovation Fellow, especially what you see here in the next slide is that not only are we looking at habits, preferences, and ability, but now we're starting to look at identity, which we kind of talked about based off of the poster that the Ontario government kind of put in, because the context of who we are is so important, especially as we start to kind of think about programs, products, services, customization, personalization, especially as we start thinking about emerging technology in the government and how to better meet the needs of our customers, users, citizens, so forth and so on. And then with that said, ultimate goal here is the next slide, which is really inclusion, diversity, equity, and access. And I want to call out the Indiana Arts Commission in the state of Indiana,
Awesome.
who kind of put out their idea. You know, in federal spaces, we call it diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility, and so it's DEIA. And so there's a lot of exciting executive orders coming out in this space, but just want to call out the really amazing work on the state level in this space and the framing. And so with that, you know, if you think about your work, a lot of it is all about, you know, ideation, iteration, and validation. And so I hope that this helps. And there's one other thing that I also kind of want to mention is that the research landscape, which you hopefully see in this next slide. And so we've talked a lot about what is accessibility, and Adam mentioned perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But then there's also standards, which Joel started to mention. Some of it are legal. Some of them are, for instance, like WCAG. I know in the chat, Mike mentioned some upcoming new standards. But generally, there's conformance, compliance, and governance. But then how this translates into our design and research practices, once again, if there's 4 things you walk away with today, is when you're doing this work, really understand ability, identity, habits, and preferences. And Joel, I know that you are such a leader in this space. Any other thoughts on inclusive design and research?
I really like the work that Henny
and that group at Barclays did. I think it really embodies inclusion and just the idea of work that you know, the art community in Indiana put together. It all fits together, and then we tie this all together with the guidelines. So we come from a humanistic approach, and then we can go into more of an organizational approach. So it all merges together. So it's really helpful to see both sides of this in order to be able to implement inclusion on a larger scale.
We're going to transition into assistive technology. These are solutions and understanding the context of use in addition to digital platforms, which Joel and Adam will also be walking us through. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. And what you see here is a white cane, as well as somebody who is using this white cane and has a guide dog. So Joel, take it away.
Yeah, so we're seeing people using assistive technology in a physical situation. Like, I don't know how many of you have experienced the white canes or people using white canes, but that really provides someone who doesn't see, who's blind, orientation, keeps them from falling down, keeps them from running into things. Same thing with the guide dog. The guide dog's trained to move around things or on command do things like find a door. So that's, you may not think of a guide dog as assistive technology, but I can tell you mine is super assistive, and she's cute too. And then we have other pieces of assistive technology here, like we're seeing the relay tools that people with hearing challenges use, where some of my friends, they don't hear at all, so they're using keyboards. They're typing back and forth, and when they're conversing with somebody who speaks back, sometimes there's a third party in the middle translating back and forth. So my friend has the keyboard typing, and the person in the middle gets that message, and he or she says it to the person that's involved in the other end of the conversation. That person on the other end of the conversation talks back. The person in the middle types back to my friend, and they go into a conversation very smoothly like that. I have a friend that graduated from Harvard Law. She spoke to Barack Obama this way, but it was Barack on one side typing, and she was typing on the other side. And since she's also blind, she was reading in Braille what he was typing to her. These are all examples of the tools there. Second, the third slide, we have the hearing aid. Think of how in a physical environment that assistive technology has been a huge leveler for people who can't hear or who are hard of hearing. They can get some sounds, and they can understand what's happening around them with those tools. But so these are physical. Let's talk about what the tools are in the digital space. So I think I mentioned before, I've lost a lot of vision, and I consider myself blind now. So in this case, I am using a Braille display. So this thing will put Braille on the screen. Since I'm a visual learner, I use a lot of sound to hear what I'm doing. Like, for instance, is my phone. 12:57 p.m. It talks to me. It tells me what I need to do. But since I'm a visual learner, I still have this thing where I need to read. So my Braille display will turn the text on the screen on a web page, on an app, into text, so then I can read it, and then that gives me better understanding. You have other tools like captioning on videos is super important for my friends with cognitive disabilities and for people obviously who have hearing challenges. I've had a lot of people who, by reading that transcript or reading those captions, even if they're not deaf, they get a better understanding than if they're just watching a video. There's so many examples of assistive technology. These are just a few, but there are tons of them. And there's new technology that's coming out all the time. Hey, Adam, what do you have to add in this?
Well, I think it's interesting to see how these physical tools have made the jump to digital platforms. And I think what's beautiful about the internet and the devices we have is that we have this ecosystem of digital platforms that's constantly expanding. And the opportunities to make things more accessible and to bring some of this assistive technology is really like building. And some of these, what we mean by digital platforms is, something like an operating system. We kind of touched on this earlier. There's a staggering variety of access for this. And to reiterate, we use all these different platforms to access information. I mean, again, we have different browsers, and those have different extensions and plugins. We have now augmented and virtual reality, which has really changed how we can engage with our world, both physically and online. And each of these have their own forms of assistive tech. And I would strongly encourage, if you haven't, to check out the accessibility options on the device you use. For instance, Mac OS has a pretty robust accessibility suite that's been building for a really long time. And it's built right into your operating system. It's in your system preferences. I highly recommend you jump in, kind of poke around and see kind of how some of these physical items have made the jump to this digital space. And digital assistants like Siri and Alexa, they come from the mobility community. If I'm a quadriplegic, I can use my voice to affect changes in my environment. This is being used on the devices we use every day. When I order toilet paper, I'm saying it to this device and it's working, for me. And all these options are in here. I mean, VoiceOver is the thing that I accidentally turn on with a key combination all the time, which has made me actually use it and understand it. And I think that some of these options, going through, and if you haven't gone through these, what it can help you do is understand what tools are available to people and how those can be used. And that'll in turn, one, build empathy, but also give you a sense of how do these things work and how can I apply this to the work that I'm already doing. And it's, they're on everything. Here are the accessibility options from iOS. Here is accessibility options for Windows called Ease of Access. And again, the options available to you cover everything, from audio to captions to even keyboard controls, getting sticky keys or toggle keys. All of this is already built in and in Android. And I think the point that we want to make with this is that we all interact with the web differently. Every single one of us who are on this chat right now or who are watching this on YouTube, we're on something different. And in order to accommodate that, you want to make sure that you're making the products accessible, your products accessible, to ensure that people with all abilities can access it, both confidently but then consistently, And one of the things that I want to really stress to everybody is that you don't have to be very deep in this world to be an advocate for digital accessibility. There are ways to implement it from where you are and how you can apply them into your workflow. And just know that at the end of the day, accessibility is about people. We're talking about technology and platforms, and those are important, but they're secondary. It's about people. And in order to be an advocate, luckily, you don't have to know everything in order to be an advocate. All you need is a basic set of tools and a basic understanding of what some of these concepts are. We talked about core and some of the items there, but we wanted to talk about how to apply these in the work that you're doing. Let's say you're a designer or an engineer or a content creator. There are places in every workflow and in every role and position where some of these things can be implemented. And maybe not directly, but knowing what some of these are can help you both identify when something is inaccessible and also be able to talk about it with people, have the conversation and make sure that people understand why something needs to be accessible, but also what makes that. So I've broken this down into a few concepts, and this is just a small portion of the larger ecosystem of what accessibility is, but these are things that we found that, if you're working on your own site or working, in a role, in a federal role, these are things you may come into contact with in day-to-day. So we wanted to talk about some considerations for you to keep top of mind that you can apply. So I'll jump right into these. I've broken these down into kind of bigger buckets because we could go on for a very long time and we don't have it. So I wanted to kind of put these into these buckets to kind of help you kind of understand where you can apply them. And this first one is wield fonts appropriately. What we say is important, and how we say it and how that looks is also important. So, choose well-designed fonts. Like this one, the Code for America team chose a really readable font for this. Use heading tags properly. If you've worked on your own like Wix site or WordPress site, you've likely seen a header option with these H1 and H2 and H6 and maybe not known what those are. Those are actually signposts for assistive tech. They add hierarchy to a page. Like an H1 is the title of the page. This is your main point. And H2 is like a section of a page. And H3 is a subsection, and so on and so forth.
Hey, Adam, can I jump in here?
Please.
Adam's point is super important, and I can tell you exactly why. I use those headings to know what's important on a page. With that hierarchy, I can tell what the content relates to, what things are parallel to each other, what's a bigger concept than another. If those headings aren't right, I get really confused, and I just have to read all the content, and I can't really get a real understanding until I'm done. But with the headings, I can go to exactly where I need to go and get the right information when I need it.
Yeah, so they're not just different size text. They actually have a real application. And making sure that, avoid mixing styles. Like, don't use all caps. To somebody who has limited visibility, all caps can just look like a rectangle. There's a reason that letters have a shape. They have ascenders, they have descenders, because we can identify them with that. And taking away those identifiable marks makes it more difficult to read. Talk here about link language. Links and how they're used is endlessly fascinating to me. And I just want to kind of say here that, links are a really good opportunity. They can set an expectation for a user. Like, you can tell somebody what'll happen when you click on this thing. And a lot of times, you can go around the internet and see that there are links that are just read more or click here. And if you're using an assistive device, or even if you're just looking for links, that doesn't have context somebody needs in order to make an informed decision. So making sure that spelling the item out, setting an expectation, again, that's an opportunity for you to make something more accessible. And making them visually distinct. I know there's some trends to make sites look a little more uniform. Well, that makes it harder to identify what you can click on. So making sure that there are hover states and making sure that it's focusable is really important. And make sure that it's a different color or a different style. This gets into language. Say your message loud and clear. And what I mean by that is spell things out. I've worked with a lot of technical writers and a lot of scientists in my career, and they speak their own language. And what I want to emphasize here is that a lot of times your audience is not you, again. So there are a lot of nuances to language, like abbreviations and initialisms and acronyms and jargon and all these things. That may not mean something to a certain person. And, worst case, somebody could misinterpret it, and it could lead to a bad decision. So when possible, make sure to explain things, define them in context, provide pronunciations for complex words in context. So I'm looking at you, content people. This is an opportunity to really explain things in a plain way. And plain language is not dumbing down content. It's making it more accessible for everybody. Champion good color contrast. As a designer, in my first experience with color contrast was interesting. As a fresh lad out of school, being able to do whatever colors I wanted was, of course, exciting, but not realizing that in itself could be a problem. And making sure that, especially with fonts on a background, making sure that they're distinguishable. Can you see a font, and I have an example here, can you see that white on yellow? Not really. Can you see the light blue on a lighter blue? No. So there's actually a measure in place for an ideal contrast ratio, and it's 4.5 to 1. Again, this applies to text and its background. So if you have that much of a difference, great, you're doing a good job. If not, consider changing the color, if not the background, the font itself. And if you're not sure what the difference is, use a color contrast tool. If you just search color contrast tool on Google, you'll get a ton of results, and they're free. So why not just use it and learn kind of what those differences are? And here's an example of a color contrast tool. I mean, it's this simple. It's taking a hex code, pasting the foreground color and the background color, and then you get a contrast ratio. This is 8.19 to 1. Yay, that's above the 4.5 ratio. So good job. That's easy for somebody to see. And then ensure images are readable. And we talked a little bit about this previously. Just make sure to use alt text. Even Twitter has implemented alt text now. Use it when you tweet something or tweet an image. This allows you to add a description to an image that somebody can't see. So you can provide a picture to narrative by adding alt text. And if it aids in understanding, that could be a pretty significant chunk if alt text isn't applied to an image that is necessary to understand content. So you want to make sure it's descriptive, but not overly so. You don't have to write a novel for it, but just making sure that it makes sense. If an image is there and there's a reason for it, say what the reason is. And if it doesn't have a reason, maybe get rid of it or don't put up alt text on it. And these items are just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, these are things that you may touch day to day, but these are areas where anyone can make an impact. And I want to say from that, if you see something, say something. If you see something's inaccessible, even if you're not that person who has created it, or you're a person who's in a different role who may not have a say in that, it's one thing to identify something that's inaccessible, but it's another thing to challenge it. So speaking up and being an advocate for accessibility means identifying and saying something. And there are a lot of tools that are built into browsers that you can use to identify things without even having to really know the tenets of it. There's a tool in Chrome, there's Axe, and there's Accessibility Insights tool that can run tests and tell you exactly what's wrong and a solution to fix it. And that's what's important here, is if you're saying something and want to get something changed, be solution-oriented. Go to somebody with a solution and leverage these tools in order to understand, one, what the inaccessibility is, but then how do you solve it? And that's going to really meet somebody who maybe is like, I don't want to fix this right now, but you can kind of meet them halfway and say, well, this is how this can happen. And also identify opportunities for inclusion. And there are a lot of different roles and phases in a creative process, in the product development process. And there are opportunities, like for discovery. Understand the abilities, identities, habits, and preferences of your user and customers. Take the time to, one, look at your audience, but then also, like, what is the nuance in that? We talked earlier about including some of the typically excluded users. Make sure that you're accounting for that. In design, something as simple as considering different types of color blindness or visual acuity. Making things legible is way better than making something beautiful that nobody can read. And if you're getting into testing, again, include different groups that you may not normally include. And don't just include your target audience. Bring some people out who are in groups that have less of a voice, and bring them into your user testing.
They may be your target audience, you just don't know it yet.
You just don't know it, yep. And I think the key point here is, like, remember, like, we're all different, and that's cool. Like, there is no normal. Every single person in this session who's watching this has a different lived experience. And there's a lot of value in opening yourself up for these different lived experiences. So making space to hear what these experiences are, it adds value not just to ourselves, but in the things we create. We're getting these different lived experiences and creating more accessible and nuanced products. And it raises the baseline, not just for users who have a disability or not, but literally every single person who accesses your content. And hopefully we made it clear that it doesn't take a ton of work to make that so. So just even making small steps to raise that baseline and be more inclusive and more accessible, that's a good start. And I think that's pretty cool. Anything to add, Pia or Joel?
I have one. Well, we're all accountable.
Yes.
It starts with us.
Exactly. Okay. Well, with that said, hey, we are almost exactly at our time.
Yeah.
On track.
Thank you so much, Adam. I also posted our LinkedIn in the chat. Feel free to connect with us. I know we have a lot of questions. We're going to do our best to try to get through everything, but we're also happy to connect in the future and also answer them. So if for some reason we're not able to get to your question, feel free to reach out. But in any case, let us go ahead and jump right into it. All right, so question from Courtney Cagle. Hopefully I said your name right. What are your suggestions for asking individuals about accessibility accommodations for events?
So I've always seen like a survey type of thing, or just even the simple statement where you make it okay to ask for accommodation. Like I've seen statements where they'll say, we intend to make our platform as accessible as possible. If you need an accommodation, please reach out to us by this time. Giving the guidelines and giving a timeline and giving a path to ask for those accommodations is the first step.
Yeah, and I actually just gave a presentation on this yesterday, so it's fresh on my mind. So for event accommodations, if you are going, obviously, you know, do a survey as Joe mentioned and ask if you need any accommodations, please let us know. Self-identification is always the best way. But in any case, before your event, what you want to do is to obviously make sure any media is accessible. So for instance, you want to just make sure that, for instance, if you're showing a video, make sure that has captions. You know, then of course, with accommodations, you might see things come through down the pipeline. Like some people prefer, instead of captions, sometimes people like ASL, which is American Sign Language. And then there are times where, for instance, if you're in a physical space, somebody might have an allergy about a scent. So one thing I had to do at work once was go through the whole entire building and make sure there was no scented products. So that survey is really, really key. And then another thing is especially in a large meeting, that's very interactive, especially if you have people with vision disabilities, or just so it's easier for people who have cognitive disabilities, as well as hearing and auditory disabilities, to say your name before you start talking. So for instance, hi, my name is Pia, and also let people know when you're done. And then what else? What else came in? I have a lot, but those are the main ones. And then of course, if you're, you know, bonus points if you can send out your presentation slides in advance, but especially if it's towards the end and you send them out, just make sure, kind of like what Adam kind of talked about, you know, did you choose fonts and color contrast and all that other stuff that are readable and understandable. But yeah, there's so much, and there's a lot of really great resources. But as somebody mentioned, unfortunately, also it's about choosing a platform that's inclusive. Like I personally almost threw an event on Clubhouse once, and I actually had to, you know, think about all the accommodations involved, because as you all know, like for instance, on a platform like Clubhouse, like, you know, they don't have captions yet. So I had to think of different solutions. So also kind of keep in mind the tools that you're using and engaging, and make sure, once again, recognizing exclusion, and then being mindful of, once again, ability, identity, habits, and preferences, and trying to find tools that cater to, yeah. So that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that was helpful. All right, moving right along. Emily Miley wrote, what are some considerations when writing an alt text for charts and data? Are there any companies or programs leading the best practices in this?
I've done a lot of work with that, but it's all been in guiding content producers. Really, when you're looking at image descriptions, what you really want to think about is, what is the main takeaway you're trying to give by that image, that chart, by that diagram, and then you summarize it. And if you need more data, you give people the option to drill in. Like one of the old techniques I remember, especially with chart data, because I was looking at a lot of securities data, like stock data. being able to go into the table of numbers is useful, but I may not need that initially, but having that path is really important.
Right, Adam, anything else you want to add there?
I think it's really just, you know, if it's hard to explain, or if it's, you know, if it's something that becomes really difficult, maybe it's rethinking the format. Is that really the best way to convey this information? And maybe if it's hard to describe it another way, it's not in the right format. So maybe think about, okay, well, I have this chart, but does it need to be a chart? You know, can I write this out in plain language? Can I bullet this out? So, you know, I think there are some companies doing the work. I don't know any specific ones or could name some right now, but I do think it's like really thinking about like what are you actually trying to achieve, and can you make it? Is it easy to do? Great. You know, if not, rethink it.
And you may even, in rethinking it, you may make it more inclusive to everybody.
Yeah.
And even the people that didn't think they needed inclusion may benefit from it. Think of the automatic doors in the restroom again. It's like something that was thought of for one group of people, but it benefits everybody afterwards, and people can't live without it now.
All right, so thank you for that. We're going to go ahead and move on to another question. And so this one is from Lauren Burke. Any suggestions on when the higher ups say things like, we hardly have any residents with insert disability here, or this isn't going out to many people. It's okay to send it even though it's inaccessible. So suggestions on that.
That smells to me like the origins of a lawsuit.
Yeah.
That people aren't aware that they're going to be stepping into. There's a lot of legal actions happening both at the federal, state, and private level. It's become a much more focused issue. You don't have to think about accommodating numbers of people. You need to think more about accommodating people from a humanistic perspective. Managers may not understand it from that standpoint, but it is a real thing. Being able to grow your product audience and being able to avoid messy legal wrangles. I mean, those are two super important pieces in any of this stuff that if you don't consider it, you are in a risky area.
Well, and I think too that it's honestly just kind of lazy. Like, one, how do you know?
It's an excuse.
Yeah, how do you know that there aren't the residents with X, Y, or Z? And yeah, it may not be going out to a lot of people, but that doesn't mean it's not important for it to be understood by them. So I do think coming back with, well, one, obviously the legal ramifications. And we've seen some decisions that have been made that, you know, are because of this just kind of laziness. So just, you know, I think it's okay for these, well, one, if you have a good process anyway, you know, you're already kind of accommodating for this. So sometimes you just need to push forward and try to make things as accessible as you can, even if the higher ups are saying, well, we don't have time for that, or it's only going out to people. You can already take steps to work on that product and make it accessible anyway. But then coming back with like the human side of things, you know, it's like, well, that's not a good excuse. Like these.
And justification by numbers,
yeah,
it's a slippery slope, because especially people who don't disclose a disability or have an invisible disability, like a cognitive one that nobody knows about, well, you can't count them because they're not known. They're not a known factor, but they could really impact your product.
For sure. All right. So we are joined by Antoine RJ Wright. So please go ahead and ask your question. Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Done that so many times myself.
you there, Antoine?
I'm hearing like the access to the mic, but it's not kicking in.
I think we can give Antoine some time and move on to another question.
Sure. And if worse comes to worse, just type it out in the chat.
But yes, feel free, Antoine, to just type it in the chat. For some reason, this feature is not working as expected, but feel free to post your question in the chat.
Jen, look like we have 5 more minutes to answer some questions, I think.
Indeed. All right. So while we're waiting for Antoine's question, a question came up about which governments in the world do you see are leading on digital accessibility? I'm biased, and so I just want to call out the amazing work that's being done by all of my colleagues at the Department of Justice, the ADA. Super excited with a lot of things coming down that pipeline, as well as Section 508 and the various offices that work towards disability inclusion in the workplace. So really, really excited to be a Presidential Innovation Fellow. And by the way, in case you didn't catch it in the beginning, applications for the Presidential Innovation Fellow close tomorrow.
Subtle.
Subtle, but you'd be surprised what is possible in 24 hours and getting that application in. I know that's what happened to me, but in any case, all right. So
can I answer that question too? So at the state level, you have some states that are really leading too. Like New York and California are pretty strong advocates for accessibility within government. Also, Canada is awesome in terms of accessibility, and the UK government, there's been a long-standing focus on accessibility. We mentioned Barclays with Henny and Leonie and Hayden and Eric. That's all Britain, and that was a while ago where they came up with those rules, and it was well received because the environment is accommodative of that. And
there's some great systems that are built around accessibility that are out there. Like Gov.uk has a design system, in US WDS, the United States Web Design System. There are things that have been built, by and for government that are already there that are a great foundation to start from.
And by the way, shout out to a lot of folks in California. I must say that what's happening in Oakland on racial equity, accessibility, and just intersectionality and all this amazing work that they're doing. Also, absolutely. Definitely check out. And I would also say New York, they have a chief accessibility officer. So just saying, that's a very important role to open up in case you don't have that yet. All right, so we have time for one last super quick question, but I just want to say shout out to all the work across government, state, local, territorial, indigenous, everything. Anything in this space is welcomed and is of impact and great value. But in any case, for a quick question, what does the panel think about plugins like Accessibility?
Painful. It actually is a barrier to me using a site when those overlay tools are on there. For one, I already have my accessibility ready. Just if you design based on the standards, I'd be able to use your site. But when you add another layer, I have to fight with that layer. So I have to ensure that my assistive technology is working with that widget, and I can know how to adapt that widget for what I need. And half the time those don't work properly. So I end up leaving sites when I'm fighting like that. I just want to either buy something or read something, understand something. If there are too many barriers, I run screaming, and I either go to a competitor or I just don't do what I intended to do, which is even more frustrating.
Really quickly, Adam, 1 minute thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, if something's done well, you don't need something to to access it. So I think at the end of the day, it comes down to if it's filling a need, then we should address the need and the underlying reason why it exists, instead of creating tools to help people. Let's just write good code. Let's just build good systems that are accessible to begin with.
Yeah, it's much better to create an open-ended code rather than try to tightly design for one specific use case, because more likely than not, you're going to miss some stuff, and it's not going to be as good as if you left it open-ended and let people adapt to a good design.
All right, and it is time. And with that, I leave you with this final thought. Without research, it's just luck. So, you know, just I encourage you all, please design with, for, and by people of all abilities. So thank you. And as Ashley mentioned, please take the time to complete this brief evaluation. And don't forget about the Presidential Innovation Fellow, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. See ya.
Take care.